The city of Millbrook hadn't seen much change in its 150-year history. It was one of those places where everyone knew each other, where traditions ran deep, and where change came slowly, if at all. But all that was about to shift with the arrival of their newest mayor, a woman who would challenge everything the old guard thought they knew about leadership. Mrs. Henderson wasn't what anyone expected in a mayor. Growing up on the south side of town, she'd watched her parents work multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. Her father drove a city bus, and her mother cleaned offices at night. They taught her that dignity wasn't about what you had, but how you carried yourself through life's challenges. She started small, volunteering at community centers while still in high school, tutoring younger kids who needed help with their homework. That's where she first saw how a little support could change someone's entire future. While other teenagers hung out at the mall, she was organizing food drives and helping elderly neighbors with their groceries. College wasn't easy. She worked 2 jobs while studying political science, sometimes falling asleep over her textbooks in the library. But those late nights paid off when she graduated with honors, turning down fancy job offers from big cities to return home to Millbrook. She knew exactly where she was needed most. Her journey through local politics wasn't smooth. Starting as a city council member, she sat through countless meetings where older officials patted her head and dismissed her ideas. "That's not how we do things here," they'd say. But she kept pushing, kept working, kept proving them wrong with results instead of arguments. Her focus on community policing caught everyone's attention. Instead of just talking about change, she walked the streets, bringing together shop owners, residents, and police officers for coffee and conversation. She believed that people who knew each other were less likely to fear each other. Simple as that. When she announced her run for mayor, the old-timers laughed. A black woman from the South Side, running for mayor. But they weren't laughing when she won, and won big. Her victory speech wasn't about making history, though she did. Instead, she talked about fixing potholes, improving schools, and making sure every neighborhood had a voice in City Hall. Now, 6 months into her term, she was already making waves. Her office door stayed open to anyone who wanted to talk. She showed up at neighborhood meetings unannounced, just to listen. When the police department needed new training programs, she didn't just approve the budget. She sat in on the sessions herself. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Some of the more traditional officers resisted her new approaches. They didn't like being told to get out of their patrol cars and walk the streets. They grumbled about political correctness when she insisted on cultural sensitivity training. But she kept pushing forward, knowing that real change never comes easy. That's what made her different. She wasn't just sitting in an office making decisions. She was out there, in the community, showing everyone what leadership really looked like. Her parents had taught her that actions speak louder than words, and every day she lived by that principle. Little did she know that one ordinary evening would test everything she stood for, turning her personal experience into a national conversation about power, respect, and the long road to real change in America. But that's the thing about real leaders. They don't just face challenges, they transform them into opportunities for something better. The day had been longer than usual, filled with back-to-back meetings about the city budget. The mayor's eyes were tired from reading endless spreadsheets, and her hand was cramped from signing documents. The clock on the city hall wall showed 9:30 p.m. when she finally gathered her things to head home. "You should get some rest," her assistant called out as she walked past. "Tomorrow's going to be another big day." The mayor smiled and waved, knowing tomorrow would bring more challenges, more decisions, and hopefully more progress for their city. The streets were quiet at this hour. Streetlights cast long shadows across the emptying roads as she drove her city-issued car, a modest sedan that she'd insisted on instead of the fancy SUV her predecessor had used. She believed in leading by example, and that meant no unnecessary luxuries on the taxpayer's dime. Her mind wandered to the community center project they discussed earlier that day. The South Side needed a safe place for kids to go after school, and she was determined to make it happen. Lost in thought about funding options and construction timelines, she almost missed the police cruiser's flashing lights in her rear-view mirror. She checked her speedometer. She'd been going exactly the speed limit. Maybe a tail light was out. With practiced calm, she pulled over to the shoulder, making sure to signal properly. The mayor had always taught her staff that every interaction with law enforcement was an opportunity to build better relationships. Following standard procedure, she turned on the interior light, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach. Something about his walk seemed off, too aggressive, too rushed. Still, she kept her professional smile ready. The flashlight beam hit her face before she could even turn to greet the officer. No friendly good evening, no professional introduction. Just a harsh license and registration barked through the window, the light continuing to blind her. "Officer, I'd be happy to provide those," she said calmly, maintaining her composure despite the officer's hostile tone. "I'm also the city mayor, and this is a city vehicle. My ID badge is right here on the dash." The response came quick and sharp. "I don't care who you think you are. License and registration. Now." The flashlight beam didn't waver, and neither did the tension in the officer's voice. She could barely make out his badge number in the harsh glare. Officer 247. Her heart began to beat faster, but her voice remained steady. Years of handling tense city council meetings had taught her how to stay calm under pressure. "Of course, officer. I'm going to reach for my purse now to get my license." She narrated her movements clearly, remembering all the training sessions she'd attended with the police department. But something was wrong. Very wrong. The officer's hand had moved to his weapon, even though she'd done nothing threatening. His stance had shifted, becoming more aggressive. The mayor recognized the signs. She'd seen them before in officers who let power go to their heads. The routine traffic stop was quickly becoming anything but routine. As she carefully reached for her identification, she could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been unfairly targeted, every citizen who'd felt powerless in the face of authority. Little did the officer know that his actions tonight would spark a chain of events that would change their city forever. The mayor's mind was already racing, not with fear, but with determination. If this was happening to her, an elected official in a city vehicle, what was happening to other citizens? This moment, this seemingly simple traffic stop, was about to become a turning point. Not just for her, not just for Officer 247, but for the entire community. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, and this cold night on a quiet street was about to prove that truth once again. The tension in the air grew thicker as the officer's voice became increasingly hostile. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his flashlight beam still fixed directly on her face. The mayor took a deep breath, her hand still hovering near her purse where her identification waited. "Officer, I want to cooperate fully," she said, her voice remaining professional despite her racing heart. "But I need you to understand that I am the mayor of this city, and I'd like to contact the police chief." She kept her movements slow and deliberate, years of public service experience helping her maintain composure. The response came like a thunderclap. "I said out of the car now." The officer's free hand slapped against the car roof, making her flinch despite her best efforts to stay calm. In that moment, she realized this was no simple misunderstanding. This was something far more concerning. Time seemed to slow down as she carefully unbuckled her seatbelt. Her mind raced through every police training session she'd attended, every community meeting where citizens had shared similar stories. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, the city's highest-ranking official, facing the very behavior she'd been working to change. As she opened the car door, the cool night air hit her face. Her suit jacket, the one she'd worn proudly during today's budget meetings, now felt like flimsy armor against what was unfolding. The officer stepped back, his hand still resting on his weapon, treating her as a threat despite her obvious compliance. "Walk to the back of the vehicle," he ordered, using language that grew increasingly disrespectful with each word. The mayor complied, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step measured and careful. She could see passing cars slowing down now, witnesses to this surreal scene. Standing at the back of her car, she kept her hands visible and her dignity intact. "Officer," she began again, her voice clear and steady, "my ID is in my purse. I'd like to show you who I am, and then we can discuss why you pulled me over." It was a reasonable request, delivered with the same diplomatic tone she used in City Hall. But reason seemed to have no place here tonight. The officer's response was to grab her arm roughly, spinning her around to face the trunk. "Spread your arms," he barked, as if she were a common criminal rather than a public servant returning from a day of working for the community. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a cell phone camera shutter. Someone was recording. A small group of onlookers had gathered at a safe distance, their phones raised, capturing every moment of this abuse of power. The mayor felt a strange mix of emotions. Embarrassment at being treated this way in public, but also relief that there would be evidence. Even as the officer roughly patted her down, she kept her voice steady and clear, knowing the cameras were rolling. "I want to state for the record that I am the mayor of this city, I am unarmed, and I am complying with all orders while reserving my right to file a formal complaint about this treatment." The words seemed to enrage the officer further. His grip tightened as he spun her around again, his face now inches from hers as he spat out words filled with prejudice and anger. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye, her gaze level and unflinching. In that moment, something shifted. Perhaps it was the growing crowd of witnesses. Perhaps it was the arrival of another patrol car, lights flashing. Or perhaps it was simply the undeniable power of dignity in the face of discrimination. The mayor stood straight, her shoulders back, every inch the leader she'd worked so hard to become. This confrontation would soon explode across social media, making headlines and sparking conversations. But right now, in this moment, it was just two people on a darkened street, one clinging to outdated prejudices, the other standing firm in the face of injustice, proving that sometimes the most powerful resistance is simply refusing to be diminished. The videos hit social media before the sun rose. Shaky phone footage showed different angles of the incident, each one more shocking than the last. The city woke up to its mayor, a respected community leader, being treated like a criminal for simply driving home from work. The story spread like wildfire through neighborhood group chats and local news alerts. By breakfast time, the police chief's phone was ringing off the hook. News vans lined up outside City Hall, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. The officer's body camera footage had been secured immediately, department policy after any controversial incident, and what it showed made even veteran officers shake their heads in disgust. The mayor sat in her office, still wearing yesterday's suit, reviewing emails that poured in by the hundreds. Some offered support, others demanded action, and a few tried to defend the indefensible. Her assistant brought in coffee and squeezed her shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity that meant the world right now. The morning news wants a statement. Her communications director said, pacing the office. "So do the major networks. This is going viral." The mayor nodded, took a sip of coffee, and straightened her jacket. She hadn't slept, but there was a fire in her eyes that fatigue couldn't dim. Outside her window, she could see people gathering in the plaza. They carried signs and banners, but these weren't angry protesters. These were citizens coming together to support their leader and demand change. Children sat on parents' shoulders, seniors brought folding chairs, and local shop owners handed out water bottles. The community was rallying. The police chief arrived, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "I've placed him on immediate administrative leave," he said, dropping into a chair. The body cam footage, it's worse than the social media videos. The things he said, the way he acted, there's no excuse. The mayor's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. We're all behind you. Do what needs to be done. Those simple words gave her strength. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been profiled, every citizen who'd felt powerless against a badge. Local business leaders started calling, offering support for whatever reforms she wanted to implement. Religious leaders reached out, asking to help facilitate community discussions. Even some retired police officers contacted her office, volunteering to help with new training programs. The incident had touched a nerve, but it was also bringing people together. The media wanted to paint her as a victim, but that wasn't her style. We're going to turn this into something positive, she told her staff, who had gathered in her office for an emergency meeting. This isn't about revenge, it's about reform. Real, lasting change. By midday, the story had gone national. Phone calls came in from civil rights leaders, government officials, and other mayors facing similar challenges in their cities. Each one offered support, but they also wanted to learn. How would she handle this? What changes would she make? Could her response become a model for other communities? Her senior advisors suggested playing it safe. Issue a standard statement, let the process work itself out. But she had a different idea. Bring me a whiteboard, she said, standing up from her desk. We're going to map out real changes right now, and we're going to do it in full view of the public. As the sun set on that long day, the mayor stood at her office window again. The crowd in the plaza had grown. People held candles now, their lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Someone had set up a small stage where community members took turns sharing their own stories of facing discrimination. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more decisions, more opportunities for change. But tonight, watching her city come together, the mayor felt something powerful stirring. Sometimes it takes a moment of darkness to show people where the light needs to shine. And she was ready to lead the way forward, one careful step at a time. The emergency city council meeting was unlike anything the old chamber had ever seen. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The mayor had insisted on holding it in the largest room available, wanting everyone to have a chance to be heard. We're not here to point fingers, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. We're here to make real change. The bruises on her arm from the officer's rough handling were hidden beneath her blazer, but the determination in her eyes was clear for all to see. City council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she laid out the reality of what had happened. The police chief sat to her right, nodding as she spoke. He'd seen the unedited body camera footage, all of it, including the racial slurs the officer had muttered when he thought no one could hear. This isn't just about one incident, the mayor continued, clicking through a presentation that showed years of complaint statistics. This is about patterns we can no longer ignore. The numbers told a story that couldn't be dismissed. Certain neighborhoods, certain groups, certain people had been bearing the brunt of aggressive policing for far too long. A young mother stood up to speak, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger. She talked about teaching her children how to act if they were stopped by police. Lessons no parent should have to give. The room fell silent, absorbing the weight of her words. The mayor's plan was bold but practical. First, immediate reforms. Body cameras would now upload footage automatically, with no way to disable them. Officers would be required to call in every stop, no exceptions. New training programs would be mandatory, not optional. But she didn't stop there. We need to change the culture, she explained, pointing to successful programs from other cities. Community policing isn't just a buzzword. It's a complete shift in how we think about public safety. She proposed regular community meetings, joint projects between police and local organizations, and a civilian oversight board with real power. Some of the older council members frowned at the cost estimates, but the mayor was ready for that too. She'd spent the night reorganizing the budget, finding ways to fund these changes without raising taxes. "We can't afford not to do this," she said, her voice firm. "The cost of inaction is too high." The police union representative stood up next, ready to object, but what happened next surprised everyone. A veteran officer, gray at the temples and respected by all, asked to speak first. "I've been on the force 30 years, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "What happened to our mayor? That's not what I signed up for. We need these changes." Hour after hour, people spoke. Store owners talked about wanting to feel safe calling the police without fear. Teenagers shared stories of being harassed while walking home from school. Even some officers stood up, speaking carefully but honestly about problems they'd seen but felt powerless to address. The mayor listened to every speaker, taking notes, asking questions. When someone raised a valid concern about implementation, she adjusted her plan on the spot. This wasn't about winning an argument, it was about finding solutions that would work for everyone. As evening approached, she stood for the final time. The room had grown hot and stuffy, but nobody had left. "Change isn't easy," she said, looking around the chamber. "But look at us, all of us, here together, having the hard conversations our city needs. This is how we make things better." The vote was unanimous. Every council member, even the usual opposition, supported the reforms. As people filed out of the chamber, there were tears, hugs, and something else. Hope. Real hope that things could be different. The mayor gathered her papers slowly, feeling the weight of the day but also its possibility. A young police cadet approached her, speaking quietly. "Thank you," he said. "This is why I wanted to become an officer, to help make things better." She smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long journey, but feeling certain they were finally heading in the right direction. Not everyone was happy with the changes. A week after the emergency council meeting, the pushback began. It started with whispers in the police department's break room, then grew into something bigger. The old guard wasn't going down without a fight. The police union president called a press conference on the steps of the precinct. Behind him stood about 30 officers, arms crossed, faces stern. "These new policies will make our jobs impossible," he declared to the cameras. "Our officers need to be able to make split-second decisions without worrying about politics." But what they didn't expect was the community's response. For every angry letter the mayor received, 10 supportive ones arrived. When critics tried to paint her as anti-police, neighborhood watch groups spoke up about how her reforms would actually help officers do their jobs better. The tide was turning, and it made some people nervous. Anonymous threats started arriving at her office. Her security detail found her car tires slashed one morning. The mayor stayed calm, but her family felt the strain. Her husband insisted on driving their kids to school himself, watching carefully for any cars that might be following. Social media became a battlefield. Fake stories appeared, trying to dig up dirt from her past. They claimed she had a criminal record. She didn't. That she was bankrupt. She wasn't. That she was part of some grand conspiracy. She wasn't that either. But she kept all the attack posts, turning them over to investigators. Someone was coordinating this campaign, and she was determined to find out who. The opposition's biggest move came during a town hall meeting. They packed the room with critics, each one ready with carefully scripted questions. "How can you lead a police department when you're clearly biased against officers?" One man demanded. "Why do you hate the people who protect us?" Another shouted. The mayor stood at the podium, letting each person finish. She didn't interrupt, didn't get defensive. When they ran out of steam, she simply pulled up the department's own statistics on her tablet. "Look at these numbers," she said calmly. "Every time we've improved police-community relations, officer safety has improved too. Every time we've increased transparency, public trust has gone up. This isn't about attacking police, it's about protecting everyone, including our officers." Some of the younger officers began breaking ranks. They shared stories about how the old approach had made their jobs harder, not easier. One rookie spoke about how he always wanted to be the kind of officer who helped people, not one who scared them. His testimony hit home with many of his colleagues. The turning point came when a retired police chief from another city flew in to support the mayor. He had implemented similar reforms years ago. "I was against these changes too, at first," he admitted to a room full of skeptical officers. "But they made our department stronger, not weaker. Our officers were safer. Our solve rates went up. Because when the community trusts you, they help you." Still, the pressure didn't let up. The mayor's critics tried to start a recall campaign. They held rallies where they called her soft on crime. They even tried to get the state government to intervene. But with each attack, her resolve only grew stronger. One evening, as she left City Hall, she noticed a small group of officers waiting by her car. Her security detail tensed, but these weren't protesters. They were officers who'd worked the night she was pulled over, who'd seen the incident unfold. "We want you to know," one of them said quietly, "not all of us think like that. Some of us want things to change too." That night, driving home, she thought about all the forces trying to stop her. The threats, the lies, the political games. They were all signs that she was shaking up a system that needed to change. And if they were fighting this hard to keep things the same, it only proved how important it was to push forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opposition, new attempts to derail her reforms. But she was ready, because this wasn't just about policies anymore. It was about proving that positive change was possible, no matter how hard some people fought to prevent it. 3 months after the incident, the police department looked different. Not just on paper, but in ways you could actually see. Officers were walking their beats instead of just driving by in patrol cars. They knew kids' names, stopped to chat with shop owners, and showed up at community events, even when off duty. The training center had been completely revamped. The old-style classroom with its rigid rows of desks was replaced by round tables where officers and community members sat together, learning from each other. The walls display artwork from local schools, drawings of police officers helping people, standing alongside community members as friends. "This doesn't feel like us versus them anymore," one officer said during a coffee break between training sessions. She'd been skeptical at first, but now she was one of the program's biggest supporters. Her latest body camera footage showed her helping an elderly man fix a flat tire, then staying to make sure he got home safely. The mayor's office created a special task force that paired officers with social workers. When calls came in about mental health crises or family disputes, they responded together. The results were impressive. Fewer confrontations, better outcomes, and grateful families who finally got the help they needed instead of just temporary fixes. Community meetings changed too. Instead of citizens and police sitting on opposite sides of the room, they worked in mixed groups, solving neighborhood problems together. When teenagers complained about having nowhere to go after school, officers helped them clean up an abandoned basketball court. Now, pickup games between cops and kids were a regular thing. The department's hiring process got a complete overhaul. New recruits had to spend time working in community service before they could even apply to the academy. "We want people who see police work as a way to help their neighbors," the chief explained to a TV reporter. "The badge is about service, not power." Officers who embraced the changes found their jobs getting easier. People started coming forward with information about crimes because they trusted the police to handle it right. Tips increased, solve rates went up, and officers reported feeling more satisfied with their work. The mayor made sure to recognize the positive changes. Every month, she handed out awards not just for bravery, but for community impact. Officers were celebrated for starting reading programs, organizing neighborhood cleanups, and finding creative ways to solve problems without making arrests. Technology played a big role too. The new body cameras were smaller, lighter, and more reliable. But more importantly, The footage was now regularly shared in training sessions, not to criticize, but to show examples of good policing in action. Officers learned from seeing their colleagues handle tough situations with patience and skill. The department's social media changed completely. Instead of just posting wanted photos and crime stats, they shared stories of positive interactions. Videos of officers playing basketball with kids or helping elderly residents went viral for all the right reasons. The community began to see police as real people, not just uniforms. Even the police station itself got a makeover. The lobby now had a kids' corner with books and toys. Community groups could use the conference rooms for meetings. High school students interested in law enforcement could join a mentorship program. The building felt less like a fortress and more like a community center. The mayor still faced challenges, but they were different now. Officers would come to her with ideas for new programs, asking for help making them happen. Community leaders brought suggestions for ways to work together better. The energy had shifted from resistance to innovation. One particularly touching moment came when a group of officers organized a surprise. They'd collected money to help a family whose house had burned down. But instead of just dropping off a check, they showed up with tools and supplies, ready to help rebuild. That's when everyone could see. This wasn't just policy change, it was cultural change. "We're not perfect yet," the mayor told a journalist who came to write about the transformation. "But we're proving that change is possible when people work together. Every small step forward makes the next one easier." 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the mayor found herself standing before the state legislature. The room was packed with lawmakers, community leaders, and police officials from across the state. She wasn't just there to tell her story, she was there to help change the law. The officer who had pulled her over that night was no longer on the force. After a thorough investigation, including reviews of past complaints and his body camera footage, the department had taken decisive action. But the mayor didn't want to focus on punishment. She wanted to focus on prevention. "What happened to me was wrong." She began her testimony, her voice steady and clear. "But it's what we did afterward that matters most." She pulled out a thick folder of statistics, showing how their city's new policies had already made a difference. Crime rates were down. Community trust was up. Officer morale had improved. Behind her sat rows of supporters, police officers who'd embraced the changes, community members whose lives had been improved, even some former critics who'd changed their minds after seeing the results. They nodded as she described how their city had transformed. The new state law she proposed was practical and fair. Every police department would need a civilian oversight board. Body cameras would be mandatory. Training requirements would focus on de-escalation and community relations. But most importantly, departments would need to track and report their statistics openly. "Transparency isn't just a word," she explained to the lawmakers. "It's how we build trust. It's how we show everyone, officers and citizens alike, that the system works for all of us." She shared stories of how public data had helped their city identify problems early and fix them before they grew worse. One legislator asked about costs. The mayor was ready. She pulled up budget comparisons showing how prevention and training actually saved money in the long run. Fewer lawsuits, less turnover, better community cooperation. It all added up to smart financial sense. The most powerful moment came when a state police commander stood up to speak. "I've been watching what they've done in their city," he said. "At first, I thought it would never work, but they've proven me wrong. This isn't about being soft on crime. It's about being smart about public safety." During breaks in the testimony, the mayor walked the halls of the state capitol, talking with other city leaders who wanted to learn from her experience. They shared their own stories, their own challenges, their own hopes for change. What had started as one incident was growing into a movement. Back in her city, people gathered in community centers to watch the live stream of her testimony. They cheered when she described their successes, nodded when she acknowledged their challenges, and felt proud to be part of this change. Local news crews captured their reactions, showing how much the community had come together. The officer who had started all this with his discriminatory behavior had recently written a public letter apology. He'd gone through counseling, taken classes on bias, and started speaking to police cadets about his mistakes. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about learning and growing. Late that evening, as the mayor prepared to head home, a young legislative aide caught up with her. "My brother's a police officer in another city," she said quietly. "He says things need to change there too. What you're doing, it gives us hope." The state law would take time to pass, of course. Politics never moves as fast as people want. But something had shifted. Other cities were already asking to copy their training programs. Police departments were reaching out to learn about their oversight system. Change was spreading, one community at a time. Driving home that night, the mayor thought about how far they'd come. That terrible traffic stop could have ended with anger and division. Instead, it had become a catalyst for positive change. Sometimes, the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, if people are brave enough to learn from them and work together to make things better. 2 years had passed since that night when a routine traffic stop changed everything. The mayor stood at her office window, watching kids playing basketball with police officers in the newly renovated community park. It wasn't a special event or a photo opportunity. It was just another normal afternoon in a transformed city. The changes they'd made had caught national attention. News crews regularly visited to document what they called the Millbrook model. The mayor kept a special shelf in her office filled with letters from other cities asking for advice. Each one reminded her that their story had become bigger than just one incident or one community. A new class of police cadets was graduating today. Looking at their faces, young, eager, diverse, she saw the future of law enforcement. Their training had been completely different from the old days. They'd spent as much time learning about community service as they had about handling weapons. They knew every shop owner's name in their assigned neighborhoods before they even got their badges. The police chief, who had stood by her through all the changes, liked to share one particular statistic. Complaints against officers had dropped by 85%. But the mayor preferred a different number: the huge increase in people applying to become officers. "They're joining because they want to help," the chief explained. "They've seen what good policing looks like." Walking through downtown, she saw the changes everywhere. Store owners chatted with patrol officers like old friends. Teenagers who used to avoid the police now stopped to show them their report cards. Even the graffiti had changed. One wall now had a beautiful mural showing police and citizens working together, painted by local artists and officers side by side. The state law it helped pass was making waves too. Other states were using it as a model for their own reforms. Police departments across the country sent observers to learn from their training programs. The mayor kept a world map in her office, putting a pin in every city that had adopted some version of their changes. The map was getting crowded. But the real proof wasn't in statistics or awards. It was in small moments, like when an elderly woman got lost and went to a police officer for help without hesitation, or when a young man with mental health issues was talked down from a crisis by officers trained in de-escalation. These weren't just policy changes, they were life changes. The original officer who had pulled her over that night had become part of the story too, but not in the way anyone expected. After leaving the force, he'd gone through a journey of his own. Now he traveled to police academies, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about how bias can blind you. His honest reflection about his mistakes helped others recognize and change their own prejudices. Community meetings look different now. Instead of angry confrontations, people work together to solve problems. When a string of car break-ins hit one neighborhood, residents and police created a solution together: better lighting, community watch programs, and youth activities to keep kids engaged after school. Crime went down, and trust went up. The mayor's office had changed too. Photos of community events covered the walls. Picnics, sports games, graduation ceremonies, all showing police and citizens together. But her favorite was a simple drawing from a third grader, a police officer and a citizen shaking hands, with the words, "We're all family now," written in crayon. As the sun set on another busy day, the mayor gathered her things to head home. A young officer held the door for her, smiling. "Thank you," he said suddenly. "My parents never trusted the police when I was growing up. Now my kids want to be officers someday. That's because of you." She smiled back, remembering that terrible night 2 years ago. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if you're brave enough to stand up and say enough. One person's courage can spark a movement. One city's changes can inspire a nation. And one moment of injustice can lead to a lifetime of progress, if people work together to make it happen.